This week we will be talking about what are collectively referred to as premodern humans. In other introductory classes, particularly if you've taken Introduction to Anthropology that addresses the four subfield approach, these populations are sometimes referred to as archaic Homo sapiens. So we'll kind of revisit their taxonomic designation and how they all fit together at the end of the lecture. But first, we're going to introduce who these species are to begin with. So our objectives include describing the general time frame and climatic conditions during which early premodern humans, who are collectively now referred to as Homo heidelbergensis, lived, to describe the general areas of the world where these early premodern humans have been found, and to compare and contrast the physical characteristics of Homo heidelbergensis with those that we talked about last week of Homo erectus, to compare and contrast the behavioral patterns of Homo heidelbergensis with those of Homo erectus, to describe the time frame during which Neanderthals lived, where their remains have been found, and their overall physical characteristics, to discuss some of the major cultural innovations displayed by Neanderthals and how these compare with those of earlier hominins, to explain what the information from the whole genome sequencing of Neanderthals and Denisovans tells us and why this is important, and to discuss some of the difficulties in trying to identify the various fossil species that date to the Middle and Late Pleistocene, specifically looking at this species level designation. So we have to start by introducing the Pleistocene. The Pleistocene, or at least the Middle and Late Pleistocene, combine to include from roughly about 800 or 780,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, or when we start to enter into what's referred to kind of archaeologically, paleoanthropologically as the Mesolithic and then the Neolithic that follows. So it encompasses much of the Stone Ages. When we talk about the Paleolithic, the Middle Stone Age is generally considered to be Neanderthals and other archaic Homo sapiens. The Late Stone Age is considered to be the sole purvey of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. So we will define the Middle Pleistocene as 780 to 125,000 years ago, and then the Late Pleistocene from 125 to 10,000 years ago. One overarching characteristic of the Pleistocene is that it is this constant kind of cycling between periods of glacial advance and periods of glacial retreat. And so we'll talk about the quote-unquote glacials and then their corresponding warmer interglacial periods. During glacial periods, temperatures drop dramatically and ice accumulates over much of the world. During the warmer interglacials, that ice then melts and temperatures warm. So we've got constant movements of these continental glaciers. There are 15 major and 50 minor glacial advances that are documented in Europe alone. The glacial advance is predominantly confined to northern latitudes, though we do see climatic shifts in southern latitudes, and in particular the tropical areas, that are predominantly mediated through prevailing rainfall. So we don't have the same spread of ice and snow in the southern hemisphere that we do in the northern hemisphere, but we do get disruption of normal kind of seasonality and periods of rainfall. Hominins are severely affected during these glacial and interglacial periods because the climate, the flora, and the animal life all shift. And so we've got movements of people as they follow movements of animals. We've also got disruption of entire cultures as these glaciers retreat and advance. And so when we look across Europe and northern Asia, we find a very dramatic impact of the movement of these glaciers. In Africa, it's most evident through these changing rainfall patterns. And so both the movement of the glaciers and these changing rainfall patterns affect migration patterns. So one thing that we have to consider in Africa, of course, is the extent or the reach of the Sahara, that's the Saharan desert. And at the periods of where it was driest, where we've got kind of the maximum r- range covered by the Sahara, we effectively cut off any migration from Central and South Africa into farther northern areas and on into Europe and the Middle East. So, migration patterns can be very strongly affected even when we're not talking about an actual glacier moving on that continent. We have a wide distribution of hominins across the Old World during the Middle Pleistocene. This includes populations in Africa, Asia, and Europe. This is one of the first, it really is the first time evolutionarily that Europe became permanently and densely occupied. We talked about Homo erectus moving into Europe, particularly these farther southern sites like Soprano, Italy, and the Atapuerca Mountains in Spain. But we see the spread of hominins across Central Europe, across northern areas of Europe as well. We see hominins reach, for example, the Suffolk Sea coast in England. And so areas that are characteristically fairly cold. So if we're, of course, extending our reach to the point that we're surviving in incredibly cold temperatures, we've got to have ways to adapt. And as we started talking with Homo erectus, we're starting to see a heavier reliance on cultural means of adaptation. And so as we talk about moving into farther northern latitudes, we're going to see this ever increasing importance of cultural innovation for things like clothing, maintenance of fires, the maintenance of hearths, and the structures that we build. You're not going to just camp out under the stars in far northern latitudes. Early premodern humans exhibit several characteristics that are considered primitive or archaic that are more like those of Homo erectus. They do, for example, have really large faces. They have a projecting brow ridge, though the shape of that brow ridge changes over evolutionary time. They have a low forehead. Their cranial vault is present, but the bones that comprise it are still fairly thick. They also, though, have a number of derived or what we would consider modern human traits. This includes a greater brain size. We see among these Pleistocene pre-modern humans a growth in brain size first to about 1,000 cubic centimeters and then on up into 12, 13, 1,400 cubic centimeters, so well within the range of modern humans. The brain case is becoming more rounded as the brain is changing its size. We see traits of the nose that are more vertical and kind of less flat to the face. We also see less angularization in the back of the skull, this area of the skull that's called the occipital. Now we'll talk, particularly when we talk about Neanderthals, about the presence of something called an occipital bun. This is a trait of particular hominin population. So when we talk about less angular or angled occipital, we're not talking necessarily about the presence or absence of an occipital bun. Over time, we see these early pre-modern hominins demonstrate even greater brain expansion and an even less angled occipital than in earlier forms. So we're basically through growing our brain to the range that we see among modern humans. We're also changing our skulls to accommodate that larger brain size. And by rounding our skulls and thusly rounding our brains, we're able to more effectively fill that volume of space that's available. From roughly 850,000 to 200,000 years ago, there are fossils from Africa and Europe that are collectively placed within the taxonomic designation Homo heidelbergensis. They are named Homo heidelbergensis because of a particular skull that was found in Heidelberg, Germany, that was thought to typify this kind of pre-modern human. There are some Asian fossils that date to the same period of time that according to some taxonomic designations, are considered a regional variant of Homo heidelbergensis. These used to be considered in the literature, and honestly they still are in many introductory anthropology textbooks, as archaic Homo sapiens. So the end of your text, the end of the chapter talks about how, with this different mindset that we have of lumpers and splitters, that we can kind of represent this whole period taxonomically as either one species, Homo sapiens, that has multiple kind of regional variants, including those that would be Homo sapiens heidelbergensis, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, or we can divide them up into species level designations that aren't representative of biological species, but instead are what we call kind of paleo species. Philip Reitmeyer stated that simply lumping diverse ancient groups with living populations, that is, including these early pre-moderns, in with modern Homo sapiens, obscures a lot of their differences. And so this is the reason why the general consensus among paleoanthropologists is to include, at the very least, the African and European pre-modern humans in this species designation of Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis is the last common ancestor of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and anatomically modern humans, which we here call AMHs. And this is important because next week we are going to talk about the kind of advent of fully modern, anatomically modern humans, fully modern populations, and their subsequent then spread out of Africa. And so as we look particularly at these regional variants of Homo heidelbergensis, and then these regional variants of other what used to be called archaics like Neanderthals and Denisovans, we do have to consider the relevance of this biological species concept, because we're going to see periods of interbreeding. And so part of the quest for the advent of completely AMHs, completely anatomically modern humans, is to determine where and when that occurred. And conventional school of thought is that it happened, of course, in the African continent, perhaps as multi-regional evolution, with a lot of gene flow between these populations, or perhaps as this single point of origin. It's debatable whether Heidelbergensis represents their own completely separate and distinct species, or whether they are just kind of polytypic regional variants of this greater overall Homo sapiens designation. They're represented at multiple sites across Africa. We've got a famous skull called the Kabwe skull that comes from a site also known as Broken Hill in Zambia that dates to between 600 and 125,000 years ago. The Kabwe skull has a complete cranium, along with other cranial elements and postcranial elements that belong to several individuals. We see the Kabwe skulls pictured here at the top. We see a massive brow ridge. We see a low vault to the cranium, so we're not yet seeing the brain kind of protrude very high above the top of the brow ridge. We also, if we had a side view, you would see a prominent occipital torus, or kind of this pointing at the back, this oval kind of protrusion at the back of the skull. The lower angle of the occipital, though, the thinner cranial vault bones and the cranial base, are considered derived traits. So already at 600,000 years ago, we're starting to see specimens that have this unique kind of mosaic pattern of evolution, this unique combination of primitive and derived traits. There's another African skull called Bodo from the Awash River in Ethiopia that dates to about 600,000 years ago, though some estimates place that as far back as about 800,000 years ago. The Bodo skull has a distinctive pattern of cut marks on it that are similar to the cut marks that we see on animal bones when humans have been involved in meat consumption. So it is possible that the Bodo individual was defleshed through some kind of ritual ceremony, whether or not that ceremony includes cannibalism. So the removal of the skin and the muscles and such from the skeleton of this particular individual. This is one of the first times that we see humans perhaps involved in not necessarily the consumption of human meat, but certainly processing the bodies of other humans. As we look across much of South and East Africa, we find the same kind of interesting mix of primitive and derived traits. We find this kind of pattern of mosaic evolution. And so these retained ancestral traits vary from site to site. The derived modern characteristics also vary from site to site, but tend to be fairly similar to what was described in the cowboy skull. There are more fossil finds of Homo heidelbergensis in Europe than anywhere else in the world, and this is most likely related to the history of archaeology and paleoanthropology as a discipline in Europe. I mean, we talked about the fascination that European peoples have had with the diversity that they find around the planet, but also because of kind of continuing intensification and urbanization of Europe. We had new buildings being constructed and old sites being disturbed by cities expanding, and so a lot of that then ties into the emergence of archaeology as a field of study. There's a cave complex in northern Spain called Grandolina, where we had what we talked about kind of at the end of this last lecture. We had populations that weren't considered Homo erectus, but that their taxonomy was unclear. These may, in fact, be really early members of Homo heidelbergensis. They also, though, in some naming conventions, have been called Homo antecessor. We have Homo heidelbergensis elsewhere in Europe. We've got the Steinum skull from Germany, the Swanscombe skull from England, the Arago skull from France. We've got the Atapuerca Mountains and multiple materials coming out of Spain. All of these pre-modern humans retain this mix of earlier Homo erectus traits combined with these derived traits of modern humans. These derived traits specifically focus on some of these characteristics of increasing brain size. So it includes increased cranial capacity, a less angled occiput, parietal expansion, and reduced tooth sizes. And of course, this reduction in tooth size as well as this expansion in brain size is going to tie into changing the diet and particularly cooking more and more of our food, which pre-digests it, which gives us this then kind of greater bioavailability of these key nutrients. The Cima de los Huertos site from Spain, which is relatively close to Grandolino, it represents a really interesting fossil. These date to between 500 and 400,000 years ago. We've got a total of about 28 individuals, including 17 distinct crania. There are more than 4,000 fossil fragments that have come out of this cave. That represents more than 80% of all Middle Pleistocene hominin fossils in the world. Definitely an overrepresentation from the Cima de los Huertos site. These hominins demonstrate early Neanderthal-like features, including arching brow ridges. By the arching brow ridge, we're talking about this kind of almost parabolic shape to the brow ridges instead of the brow ridge just being straight across. And then the projecting midface. When we talk about Neanderthals, we'll talk about how their face looks like you basically just grabbed hold of it and pulled it forward. We see that among the individuals from the Cima de los Puertos. The mitochondrial DNA research initially put them closer to Denisovans than Neanderthals, ancient humans, or modern humans, but their genome has now been more extensively examined and places them fairly squarely as early Neanderthals. So Neanderthals were moving into Europe well before this or early Neanderthal-like creatures were moving into Europe well before this 130,000 years ago that we generally mark as our beginning point for Neanderthals in Europe. Research in China indicates that we've got, again, fossil hominins that have a similar mix of ancestral or more like Homo erectus traits and these derived traits of later anatomically modern Homo sapiens. In the Asian fossils, the ancestral traits include a sagittal ridge, not quite the entire crest, but certainly a little bit of a raising point from those anchor points for the massive chewing muscles, and flattened nasal bones. Chinese researchers also point out that there are modern Chinese humans that still retain these traits, representing what they consider genetic continuity. And so, as we talk next week about single point of origin versus multi regionalism, some of the most vocal advocates for a multi regional kind of evolution of modern humans are those that are working in China. And this is, of course, debatable and not the general consensus among most academic paleoanthropologists. Another site called Dali has the most complete skull of any middle or early late Pleistocene fossil in China, with a mix of these ancestral and derived traits, and a brain size that's starting to approach this boundary of what we consider Homo sapiens brain sizes. So the Dali skull has a brain size of about 1,120 cubic centimeters, and the Dali skull is the one that's pictured at the top. We also have the Jinushuan skull, which dates to about 200,000 years ago. Jinushuan has a cranial capacity of around 1,260 cubic centimeters. This is well within the range of modern human brains, and the brain case itself has very thin bone. So we're seeing a changing of the shape over about 100 to 200,000 years that's making kind of less robust, more modern looking hominins. This Middle Pleistocene period is associated with a change in tool tradition. So at the very beginning of the Middle Pleistocene, as we've still got local populations of Homo erectus, we have a carryover of the Acheulean style stone tools that were found with Homo erectus populations. These Acheulean tools persist until almost the very end of the Middle Pleistocene as we transition to the Late Pleistocene. There is, towards the end of this period, a later pre-modern innovation that we call the Le Voilà technique that controls the flake size and shape. And so what this entailed were several complex and coordinated steps where first you pressure flake off flakes kind of around the perimeter. And so if you see the arrow here, we would take off these flakes first on kind of that first layer, the outer layer of the stone. Then we're going to come back in and interior to that, pressure flake off another series of small flakes. Then once we've got that how we want it, we do a strike kind of right here at this pressure point that causes this entire flake to come off. And when they talk about the Le Voilà tools, they compare it to like kind of the shape of a tortoise shell, that they have an arched shape on one end of them, and that the way that the pressure flakes have been broken off, or the process of pressure flaking, has led to almost like what's the scales of a tortoise shell and how they come together to make the whole. So this is indicative of increased cognition for these later early modern humans. Early modern humans may also have intensified their use of caves. They may have controlled fire. There are, for example, several hearth sites that are presumed to have been continuously maintained. They also built temporary structures. We find, for example, across Siberia, we find large collections of mastodon and mammoth ribs and tusks that would have been arranged in a circle and had a large hide stretched around the outside of them. These kind of Middle Pleistocene hominins also exploited many different food types. We do have, for example, the first evidence of the exploitation of marine resources. So as the glaciers are retreating, we end up covering up what's called the continental shelf. If you think about how the shoreline looks, right, and you talk about what was collectively known in Nemo as the drop-off. We're talking about that point by which the land, or where the landmass really dramatically drops away to the depths of deep ocean. During glacial periods, all of the continental shelf, or what leads up to the drop-off, would have been covered, or would have been exposed, is what I mean, because the water that would cover them was taken up in these large continental glaciers. During the warmer interglacial periods, however, then suddenly the continental shelf is covered again. And if you've spent any time on the shore, you recognize that the tides kind of change the coastline, right? And at low tide, in some places, you can walk out a mile or more. This area, the continental shelf, it's now covered by water, is a very rich kind of prospect for hominins in the sense that you have a couple times a day, you've got the exposure of these kind of lower lying areas. You're able to start doing things like dig up shellfish, for example. These coastal areas are characterized by a lot of crabs, for example, by lobsters, etc. And so having this area covered by water, but having the movement of the tides creates this rich kind of opportunity for these fossil hominins. Additionally, shorelines are often adjacent to wetlands, and these wetlands are going to provide the opportunity to start raiding bird nests for eggs. It is possible during the Middle Pleistocene that we see the innovation of spear throwing to hunt larger animals. We don't see the development of a tool called the atlatl, which helps to extend the reach of our spear, until much, much later. So we're not necessarily talking about effective long distance spear throwing, but we are talking about trying to remove oneself from the proximity of some of these megafauna that we're trying to bring down. So hunting something like a mammoth or a mastodon, you're not going to have to get like up under its neck and poke it through the soft area, kind of in the jaw, back of the throat, right? We're going to start to see the throwing of spears from a little bit farther away. We know that we weren't very good at it, though. We know that there was a lot of danger involved with this face-to-face hunting because a lot of the Neanderthal fossils, and we'll talk about them in a minute, are characterized by blunt force traumas that have then healed.